The Grimms and Andersen. What's the story? Hans Christian Andersen's tales, the first of which appeared somewhat later in the 1830s, are a different story altogether. These were originally written in Danish. More importantly, all of them were the author's own creation. His works were not traditional tales that carried a cultural legacy like those of the Brothers Grimm. Instead, they were all original stories crafted by an individual writer's personal experiences and a healthy imagination. Another way in which Andersen's fairy tales were different was that they didn't necessarily contain a clear, underlying moral message. One could say that there's often nothing like a tale well told to get young minds thinking. But early on, many felt that his stories only aimed to amuse, rather than to educate. In tales like The Emperor's New Clothes and The Little Match Girl, the moral of the story isn't always obvious. His main characters, good or bad, don't always get what they deserve either. And yet, with charm and twists found throughout all of them, Andersen's creations have stood the test of time just as well. All told, the values and ideas found in his stories are just as important and loved today.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to English for You. I'm Mike.
I'm Nikki.
And we are back with our article looking into some of the most famous fairy tales in the world, in world history, and also, more to the point, the people who created them. So yesterday we talked about the Grimm brothers.
The Germans.
Germans. I guess these guys today would probably work at a university and they would be called folklorists.
Oh,
right? So there might be people who travel around in Taiwan, maybe go to Aboriginal tribes, Aboriginal
to collect
villages.
the stories.
Collect stories and songs and things like that.
And do research on them.
Yeah, because a lot of these stories, like we learned yesterday with the Grimm brothers, these are oral tradition stories. No one writes these stories down, right? And as the older people in the village or the tribe or whatever, as they die, some of these stories are lost. So this is actually an area of study in universities and other places. They would be called folklorists. And I think the Grimm brothers were maybe not the first to do it, but certainly the first ones to take the stories and turn them into popular books and whatnot. So now we're gonna look at another guy, also very famous in the world of fairy tales. This is Hans Christian Andersen. He was from Denmark, not Germany, and he's very different. He actually wrote all of these stories.
He didn't collect them.
No,
he created them.
Exactly. He's much more familiar to us as the children's book author, like J.K. Rowling or, someone like that. And his stories, though, are just as popular, just as famous, and just as well known as the Grimm brothers. I don't know, maybe The Little Mermaid. Yeah, that's Hans Christian Andersen. That's one that I'm sure a lot of people are very familiar with. So let's get familiar with Mr. Andersen by checking out the article, which begins, Hans Christian Andersen's tales, the first of which appeared somewhat later in the 1830s, are a different story altogether.
OK, 那前一天我们介绍到了格林童话和它的起源，那今天我们就要继续聊聊安徒生童话。A different story 指的就是情况完全不同。那在这边课文的意思指的就是如果我们比较格林童话和安徒生童话，我们就会发现是截然不同的两种故事书。那怎么会这样说呢？让我们来继续看下去。
So of course he wrote different stories. He didn't write Snow White and things, but also that's a different situation. Right?
Exactly.
So someone might say, how was your math test? Oh, it was great. How was your English test? Oh, that's a different story. I did much worse or something like that. It's a different situation. So let's find out what the situation is here. These, the Hans Christian Andersen stories, these were originally written in Danish, okay, not German, so that is different. More importantly, all of them were the author's own creation. Yeah, he used his own imagination. He might have been inspired by things, but he wasn't taking old stories and just writing them down. He was making them up in his own mind from his own imagination.
那还记得昨天有提到格林童话是集结各种民间故事而成的吗？安徒生童话则是完全是作者原创的故事。Creation 这个名字指的是作品。The stories that the author's own creations are his own work. He created them.
His works were not traditional tales that carried a cultural legacy like those of the Brothers Grimm, right? So he wasn't collecting these stories as a folklorist. That's F-O-L-K, folk, L-O-R-I-S-T, one word, folklorist. On the other hand, Christian Andersen, no, he was an author. He was just a writer. He was an author. So they didn't carry this cultural legacy, the sort of history of these old stories in Germany, like the Grimm brothers stories, of course, did.
那 legacy 这个名词指的是遗留的事物、传统 something that's left to a person, something that's a tradition, money, or a thing. Now here's what we see today's language and focus. Let's take a look. 那今天我们看到 that 或是 those of something 可以加地方副词或者是形容词子句。those of something 指的当作指示代名词的时候，代替的就是前面提到过的特定名词或者是片语。这边我们课文看到 His works were not traditional tales that carry a cultural legacy like those of the Brothers Grimm. 因为前面已经提到了 tales， 那后面为了不想要再重复提一次，于是就用 those 来代替复数的 tales。那另外，如果要代替名词是单数的话，我们就要用 that 而不是 those 代替。
Right, so yes, Christians weren't old stories like the Grimm brothers, they were new stories. It says instead they were all original stories crafted by an individual writer's personal experiences and a healthy imagination, which is pretty much how most stories come to us, right? An individual writer, one writer on their own, will use their personal experience, their imagination, they'll make up a story, they'll write it, and hopefully we will be entertained. That's how most of our stories, of course, come to us.
Yeah, 那这些故事呢，都是根据作者的自身经验和想象力所撰写的。Craft 这个动词指的是精心制作 often passive, you say something is crafted, to make something with your own hands.
All right, so yes, Hans Christian Andersen wrote his own stories. Another way, and this is the more interesting difference, another way in which Andersen's fairy tales were different was that they didn't necessarily contain a clear underlying moral message.
Oh.
Remember that message about good and evil, right and wrong that were in the Grimm stories?
So this is just for fun.
Yeah, some of the, well, no, they weren't always fun. Sometimes they were just stories about life, and sometimes life doesn't have
a happy ending
or a clear message. Sometimes the good guy does all the right things and still loses in the end.
Exactly.
So they were, a little more, I guess we would say a little more sophisticated, right? So maybe for slightly older kids where they can understand that, in life it's not always black and white. There can be a lot of gray. And yeah, sometimes the story does not have a happy ending. Little Match Girl, I think she dies at the end. It's so depressing.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, sometimes that's okay because life isn't always that clear. So this underlying moral message that we find in the Grimm brothers stories, this message of being a moral person, right and wrong, it's not always there with Christian. If something is underlying, it's important in a situation, but it's not always obvious. It's not always easily noticed or, right up in front so you can understand it very well. It's kind of hidden, or it's maybe not, not the most important thing, but it's still there and it still should be, paid attention to, and you should still know about it because it's the underlying thing. And sometimes it's the real problem. For example, this medicine should help with the pain in your stomach, but we will have to do more tests to find out what the underlying problem is. So your stomach hurts, take this, you'll feel better, but why does your stomach hurt? That's the underlying problem.
那上一篇我们有提到格林童话通常会有一个寓意，但是安徒生童话则不尽然哦，不一定每一篇都会有什么意义。Underlying 这个形容词指的是真正的、潜在的 not so clear to see. So for example, underlying problem 潜在的问题 underlying message 潜在或者是真正的讯息，或者是 underlying concern 一个担忧。那另外看到 not necessarily 指的就是未必，那它的形容词是 necessary 名词 necessity 指的就是必需品。
All right, back to the article. One could say that there's often nothing like a tale well told to get young minds thinking. But early on, many felt that his stories only aimed to amuse rather than to educate. So maybe, parents or teachers were kind of like, we want these stories to have a clear moral message. Mr. Andersen, yours don't, so they're not as valuable for us or something. They don't teach kids in that way. And maybe Hans Christian Andersen was like, well, kids are smarter than that. You don't always need to hit them over the head with a, this is right, that is wrong, do good,
Yeah, that would be very
bad.
tiring to always be, you have to be learning something.
Exactly. It always feels like you're being taught to, or, people don't think you're smart enough to figure this out on your own.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. I mean, think of Harry Potter, right? Sometimes bad things happen to good people in those books. It's not always nice and happy and clear. But yes, it's all about trying to educate kids, but how do we educate them? That was the sort of argument here. But to educate basically is to teach, to inform, to give information to make smarter. Your teachers will educate you at school. Your parents will educate you at home. And a book or an interesting website can also educate you by teaching you things. For example, Elena has offered to educate us about Greek food and culture. She's Greek. She knows about it. We want to learn more. She will teach us.
Educate 这个动词指的就是教育 to teach.You can educate somebody about something. 那它的名词 education, 那我们也可以说 receive education 去上学。那 educational 这个形容词指的就是教育的 educational game, educational program. 那另外看到 early on 在初期 at the early stage or in the beginning. 那另外他们也说会 amuse 这个动词指的就是娱乐消遣 make somebody laugh or smile or entertain.
So here's some examples.In tales, or stories, in tales like The Emperor's New Clothes and The Little Match Girl, the moral of the story isn't always obvious. Yeah, so it's not always as clear as it is in the Grimm brothers type of stories. Here we had a few titles there. The Emperor's New Clothes. You guys might know this one. The emperor, of course, wants to wear the finest clothes. None of the clothes are good enough until someone says, here's your invisible clothes, and he's walking around naked.And all the people are so impressed and scared of the emperor. They're like, wow, your suit's really beautiful. Until a little boy is brave enough to say, dude, you're naked.
You're naked.
You're not wearing any clothes. So it was the little child who spoke truth to the powerful man when all the other adults were scared because they could lose something, if the king or the emperor is mad at them. And what is an emperor? Well, I have written here a super king. That's kind of like an emperor. A king will rule one country, one land. An emperor usually rules many different countries. Right? So in Rome, Caesar might have been the emperor because they ruled not just Italy, but France and Britain and Spain and parts of Egypt and that kind of thing. Queen Victoria in Britain was the empress. That would be the female version because when she was in power, Britain controlled like 25% of the world or something, not just England and Britain, but other countries as well. So an emperor is a king, an empress would be a queen, and they control a huge area of land, not just their own country. For example, the emperor ruled his vast empire for over 40 years. And if something is obvious, like the obvious moral lesson in the Grimm brothers story, it's clear to be seen, it's easy to be seen, it's easy to understand. Even kids can understand the message in these stories because they're so obvious, they're so clear and easy to get. For example, from the color of his face and hands, it was obvious that Tyler had gotten a sunburn while swimming at the beach yesterday. He was red like a fresh new apple.
那像是大家耳熟能详的国王的新衣还有卖火柴的小女孩，这些故事背后的寓意好像都不是那么的明显，反而是看完之后读者可能会会心一笑。Emperor 这个名词指的就是帝王 a man that rules an empire. 那 empire 这个名词是 a group of countries or organizations controlled by one person, 一个帝国。So for example, the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire. 那另外我们看到 obvious 这个形容词指的是明显的、清楚的 easy to see or understand. You can tell it's clear. 那在这边课文的意思就是说这些寓意并不是这么的明显，也就是说 the moral of the story isn't always clear. We can't really tell if there's a moral or not.That's
true. And of course, the stories are that also is reflected in the characters. His main characters, good or bad, don't always get what they deserve either. In other words, there's not always a happy ending for the good characters and a sad or bad ending for the bad characters. Sometimes life isn't always nice and simple and neat that way.
而且前面提到由德国人撰写的格林童话，我们通常可以很明确的点出什么是对，什么是错的。但是安徒生童话里的坏人却不一定都会得到相对应的报应。那 deserve 这个动词指的是应得 ，if you deserve something, you earn something by good or bad behavior。也就是说，因为做了一件好事或者是坏事，所以应该要得到某个结果。For example, I work so hard every day, I really deserve a raise or a holiday. 我很辛苦工作，我应该要被加薪，或者是我可以去放假。 Or when your friend is dating someone awful, you can say, you deserve so much better, someone better. 就是你在你的朋友跟一个很糟糕的人约会，你就说你值得更好的。
That's exactly right. And the little match girl, she deserved better, right? She doesn't get what she deserves. She's poor, she's hungry, she's selling matches in the middle of the winter to help her sick mother at home. And what happens?
She dies.
She dies in the snow and freezes to death.
Yeah.
That's it. It's so sad, but
that's life.
Sometimes that happens, right? Bad things can happen to good people. It doesn't always work out well. But it says, as we continue, and yet, or however, with charm and twists found throughout all of them, Anderson's creations have stood the test of time just as well. Yeah, it's true. Even though they're sad, if they were only sad, I don't think they would still be so popular today. People get a lot of entertainment from them. There's charm in there. There are twists, little surprising, changes in the story. Things happen that you don't expect. And of course, they bring things like mermaids to life. So it's all very interesting. That's part of their charm. When we talk about the charm of something, this is something that's really very personal, but it's basically in a pleasing or attractive quality or the power to be pleasing or attractive to someone. If you meet someone and after 5 minutes you feel like they're your best friend and they're so interested in you and you really have a connection to that person, then they obviously have a lot of charm. And places as well can have charm. When we think of a little village that's so cute and it looks like it maybe comes from a Grimm Brothers fairy tale, we could say that little village has a lot of charm. For example, here, even though she loved living in a big city, Eileen couldn't lie and say that the tiny fishing village didn't have a special kind of charm. She might not want to live there, but it is very lovely. And we also had this word throughout. Yes, there's charm, there's twists, there's interesting characters throughout all of Anderson's stories. That just means in every or into every part of something, all right? So if there's noise throughout your apartment, maybe someone upstairs is using power tools, and even if you go to one room and close all the doors or something, it's still there. It's very, very loud or something. It goes everywhere. It reaches all parts. Here's another thing that might be not so good to have throughout. Please open a window. The smell of your fish cooking in the microwave is going throughout the house. Even my bedroom smells like fish now. Thanks.
但是安徒生童话没有因为少了寓意就没有人看，反而是因为它有很多不同的情节，让它经得起时间的考验。Stand the test of time 指的就是经得起时间的考验。那另外 charm 这个名词指的是魅力或者是迷人的特性。The quality of something or of some that makes people like them. 那另外形容词 charming 指的就是 very attractive. So for example, Prince Charming, 白雪公主里面的白马王子就叫做 Prince Charming. 那另外 throughout 这个介系词指的是遍及四处 in every part, during a particular period. So here 在课文里面讲的就是 with charm and twist found everywhere in all the stories.
All told, the values and ideas found in his stories are just as important and loved today. Yeah, they may not be as happy as some of the Grimm Brothers stories have these happy endings. But all told, when we look at the situation in total, right, kind of take a step back and look at all of the stories and don't just focus on the really sad ones or something. All told, the values and ideas found in his stories, while not as simple to understand as the Grimm Brothers, but they are just as important and loved today. The Little Mermaid is still one of the Disney movies that made the most money in history, right? So clearly, these stories are very popular even now.
All told 指的就是总而言之，也就是说这些安徒生童话里的意义和想法至今都还是为人所爱。那喜欢今天的节目吗？快按赞追踪我们的 YouTube 频道和 Facebook， 不要忘记开启小铃铛，掌握第一手的英文学习内容。
And our chat question is asking, in what other ways are the Grimm's and Anderson's fairy tales similar or different, and which do you prefer and why?
Oh, I would say they are all, I don't know, cute, educational, but they all have animals.
That's interesting. Do they all have animals? That's a good question. I think Anderson,
they're all animals.
Well, no, the little match girl is not an animal.
Yeah, but most of them have.
They do have some animals in there. Yeah, and the Grimm Brothers, I'm not so sure. That's an interesting take on it. I would also say, I don't know if this is exactly true. The Anderson stories, some of them take place in cities. right? Whereas most of the Grimm brothers are kind of in
forest.
countryside, forest, or in like magical
Yeah.
lands long ago, castles and that kind of thing. And that's also reflected in the fact that Anderson wrote them, when in the 1830s when people lived in cities and whatnot. So those are some interesting ones. What about you? Can you think of your own similarities and differences between these stories? Or maybe just talk about your favorite one and what good moral lessons you could learn from them. All right, guys, take care. We'll be back with more good stuff soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Vocabulary Review.
Underlying. Underlying. Peter found out that his back pain was caused by an underlying problem he hadn't known about. Educate. The bank is trying to educate its customers on the importance of using strong passwords for their online accounts. Emperor. During his rule, the emperor was known for his fair and just treatment of his people. Obvious. It's obvious that Jonathan cheated on this test. This isn't even his writing. Charm. Jordan often tries to get out of doing housework by using his charm to please his parents. Throughout. The tea shop has branches throughout Taiwan. You can find them almost everywhere.
智慧小补帖
Creation. Legacy. Amuse. Deserve.